Imagine your life is just beginning. You have big plans for the future and a spirit yearning for adventure, only to have it all stolen in the blink of an eye. In the coastal city of Durban, in Kwa-Zulu Natal, a grim tale of tragedy unfolded in January of 2018. A 20-year-old girl with her entire life ahead of her was kidnapped, her body later discovered burnt almost beyond recognition. The paths of so many would intersect as the chilling events that followed would grip the nation, uncovering a sinister, never-ending, interconnected web of secrets and lies. As private investigators unraveled the mystery of the events leading up to her death, a story of obsession, deception, and a history and pattern of disturbing behavior would come to light. Although many truths would be uncovered, some questions would still remain up in the air, even to this day. This is a journey into the light that was this girl, and the darkness that stole her from this world. This is the story of an enduring and exhausting battle for truth and justice. This is the story of a girl who loved deeply, lived authentically, and embraced life in every way and form. This is Siam Lee's story. Hello and welcome back to Murder Mayhem, South African true crime with me, your host, Bella Monsoon. I know, I'm back already and you didn't even have to wait months. Imagine. And you know I'm not wasting any time. So for those of you who are new, hang with me for a minute. For those of you returning, you know the drill. You can skip ahead using the timestamp on screen. So if you're new to the channel, let me quickly introduce myself and tell you what I do here. So here it is in a nutshell. My name is Bella and I'm a registered mental health professional who just so happens to be obsessed with psychology, true crime, and uncovering the motives that drive people to do what they do. My intimate knowledge and experience within the field thus led me to create the first trauma-informed South African true crime series. This means that during this series, I post new videos looking at real-life crimes from a psychological viewpoint. During these episodes, I also like to share psychological knowledge and concepts that you may or may not be aware of in an easy-to-understand format. So if all of that sounds like something that is right up your proverbial alley, then please do consider subscribing and joining the Bellaboo family. But if you're more a fan of podcasts and not so much of watching me, that's okay. I will not hold it against you. You can find me for my sister podcast, Murder Mayhem, South African True Crime, available on all major streaming channels. So just a quick disclaimer for today's episode. Today's episode contains material citing assault and murder. As always, I mean absolutely no disrespect to the victim mentioned nor her family. The purpose of this video is to shed further light on the heinous crime that was committed while spreading awareness about the psychological nature of the narrative. This episode has been thoroughly researched by myself using publicly available resources and includes, where available, real-life accounts, footage, and images of and from individuals involved directly in the case. Without further delay, let's get into it, but first, just a quick note. Before we delve into this episode, I want to share my perspective on a topic that will be coming up frequently, and that is sex work. During my honors thesis, I worked with women who were at the time engaged in sex work as well as those who were trying to actively leave the trade. My research revealed that numerous internal and external obstacles often kept women in the industry against their wishes. From a position of relative privilege, where I myself are not compelled by circumstances to engage in a potentially dangerous occupation, I refrain from judging these individuals. And so I'm hoping that you can too for the duration of this episode. I only ask that you approach it with an open mind and view these individuals as what they are, human beings. If this is, however, something that you do find difficult to do, I encourage you to explore other content on this channel or perhaps give this episode a chance to offer you a new perspective. So let's get into it. In order to truly understand this episode, you need to not only keep an open mind, as I mentioned, but also be able to understand a little bit more about an industry that has existed since 2400 BCE. Yeah, way back when. The oldest occupation in the world, if I'm not mistaken. So as I mentioned, I studied and worked with the lived experiences of women who had been engaged in street sex sex work for multiple years. Now, as with any other industry, there are vast differences between the different occupations within this industry and their different roles. There are, of course, the most widely known group, who are either self-employed, working under an individual, working within a physical location, or alternatively working on the streets or public areas. There are also escorts, who offer a variety of services focused on providing companionship for money, which often does not include sexual acts. Then we have, of course, adult TV and film actors who engage in the action of adult media creation. On the most recent front, with the growth of technology, there are further branches of the trade which extend to pay-per-view or subscription platforms, amongst others. Yes, I am talking about OnlyFans. Regardless of the variety of services and roles, though, more often than not, individuals are all assumed to be belonging to one single grouping. And as with the entire industry, there is so much stigma against those within it. Listen, whilst there are many individuals who make the choice to enter this industry out of their own volition, there are also a vast number of others who have either entered against their will or due to a lack of other options. At the end of the day, the demand is constant and growing, and thus the supply will always continue. And every single individual out there who is not exploiting, causing pain or harm to others deserves respect. And now, with the briefest of brief overviews complete, let's get into our narrative. As I always do, let's start with the girl who had big dreams, the girl who had her life stolen, the girl who isn't here to tell her own story. But before there was her, there was Carmen Lee. Carmen would be known throughout her life, and to the media too, as Nan. And so that is what I will call her during this episode. Look, I personally don't understand the nickname, but not up to me. Nan had attended a boarding school, Wickham Collegiate in Pietermaritzburg, Kwa-Zulu Natal. After leaving school, where she had finished grade 12, she became involved in dancing whilst traveling Asia. This was a passion that she had developed within her childhood. At some point in time during her travels through Asia, her career path had changed and she became involved in the adult industry. It was through this industry that she would ultimately meet the man that she would have a child with, Howard Greenspan. Although she met Howard whilst she was in Asia, he was actually a businessman from Cape Town. Yeah, I know, it's a small world, right? The two had thus began a somewhat longer business relationship. This is not uncommon within the industry. Even with some of the women that I spoke with, they would mention how some of their clients, whom they referred to as Johns, had been long-standing customers for even as long as a decade in some cases. When I say business relationship, it was just that. More transactional, not the standard romantic relationship that you think of. Then when Nan fell pregnant in 1996, Howard had apparently agreed to financially look after the child with the promise of setting up a trust fund. And so on the 15th of April 1997, Siam Lee was born in Hong Kong at the Matilda War Memorial Hospital. So although Howard had agreed to support Siam, their relationship, much like Nan and his relationship, was purely financial. There was no real interaction between the two, especially within the context of what you would imagine a father-daughter relationship to be. Living in Hong Kong, Siam as a child was unaware of the work that her mother engaged in. The pair reportedly traveled a lot, and Siam attended Montessori preschool in Hong Kong before ultimately moving back to South Africa when she was 5 years old. The pair were incredibly close and she led a free-spirited existence, not necessarily the most conservative or traditional upbringing. That in itself was not a problem though, as their way of life at the time harmed absolutely no one. Back in South Africa, the pair lived in Kwa-Zulu Natal, where Nan continued her engagement within the adult industry along with various side hustles. Those early carefree years though grew into somewhat of an unhealthy relationship, where Siam became less of a daughter and more of a friend, a confidant to her mother. This further led to her later reportedly feeling an increased sense of responsibility to help assist her mother financially, even in her teenage years. Now, whilst this in itself is honestly not as uncommon as you may think, it increased the codependency between mother and daughter. But I'll get into that later. For now, back to life growing up. As I mentioned, her father, although not emotionally involved, did assist financially. This allowed her to attend the well-known and prestigious Crawford North Coast School. However, when Siam was in grade 5, the man whom she distantly knew as her father was brutally murdered. On the 4th of January 2005, whilst living in Clifton, a very fancy neighborhood in Cape Town, 52-year-old Howard was found shot to death. I'm not going to tell you why at this present moment, but remember that date for later. In the investigation, a 28-year-old female worker would later be arrested. And so it was at this point that the real problems began. As Howard had been paying for her schooling, things became a bit difficult, as issues arose with understanding the extent to which his will and her apparent trust fund covered her expenses. It later became a constant battle between Nan and those in charge of the trust fund, with Nan fighting just to have Siam's fees paid until she finished grade 12. And during these hardships, the relationship, which I mentioned was incredibly close and strong between the two, just grew stronger. And is often the case within single-parent households, the bond between parent and child is often a strong one. In her teen years, Siam truly came into who she was, and her social media accounts would later showcase her personality and old soul qualities, artistic and free-spirited. Her Instagram bio would read, and I quote, "Listen to your body, talk to plants, ignore people," end quote. I mean, I for one could not agree more. In later articles and coverage though, these pages and her content would lead some to create a different narrative and skewed judgments of both Siam and her life. But I'm getting ahead of myself again. She grew into a beautiful, thoughtful, and kind teenager, conscientious of her surroundings and full of kindness and love for those in her life. As she neared the end of her schooling career, she dreamed about qualifying as a teacher and returning to Hong Kong to work. Things didn't really go as planned though. And as she finished school and watched her peers all go off to university, she felt the darkness creep up on her. As others were starting their futures in the more traditional and societal sense, Siam was working wherever she could, engaged in promotional work, waitressing, and modeling. She experienced a deep longing to continue following her dreams, but the inability to do so. And these feelings would only intensify with the work that she would soon become involved in. You see, as I mentioned, her mother worked in the adult industry on and off, and soon this is what she began to rely on to pay the bills and to keep a roof over herself and her daughter's head. But she ended up bringing her work far too close to home, having clients over in the same space that herself and Siam shared. In 2017, things came to a head when Nan, her mother, had argued with a colleague at the premises where she worked at, which was near where they lived. Following this fight, Nan was subsequently burnt on large areas of her body with scalding water. Her burns would later become infected, which would result in her inability to work. With Siam being the only income stream in the family, the pair were later evicted from their home as they weren't able to pay rent for months. It was at this stage that the pair had then moved into the property just down the road where Nan worked, living surrounded by workers. Very soon, the lines would become blurred, and Siam would find herself entering the adult industry. In the beginning, perhaps Siam was feeling responsible to support both of them, wanting to do whatever she could to help the pair survive. This is the nature of a codependent relationship, especially within mother and child, where there are no clear boundaries. Ultimately, though, eventually Siam convinced her mother that she was ready and willing to enter the lifestyle. After some back and forth, her mother would relent, but state that she was to be present at every single appointment, and that no full sexual activities would be entered into. And so that is how her listing would appear on the website for the adult parlor. Siam was shown to offer erotic massage with the alias of student in training, with the subtext of her mother being present at bookings illustrated. The ad would detail services stating that there was no full house offered, aka no penetrative sex. Although it was not as intense as the work her mother was doing, as the days wore on, she became despondent, losing hope that things could be different in her daily existence. This was never her plan. Siam never pictured this for herself, and multiple times she would reach out to a worker organization, speaking about how emotionally broken she was by the work she was doing. In the time following everything that would happen to Siam, many would point the finger at Nan and the pivotal role that she had played. Whilst I do not personally condone her actions and the person I have heard her to be, this is not her story. This is not her narrative. and thus I will not be focusing my attention on her. So, back to Siam. It was through this emotionally tumultuous path that Siam would ultimately meet the man who would change the trajectory of everything. The man who would take her life and rob her of her future. In 2017, this man would take an interest in Siam. At the time, as I mentioned, her services were being advertised on a website called Red Velvet under the alias Student in Training. She was classified as a sensual masseuse. This man had reached out via the booking portal, he had visited the establishment, and after having a particular affinity for her, he had booked a dinner date, a service that was offered. He had arrived to collect her in a black Mercedes, and the two went out for dinner, arriving back at her place of residence and work at 10 p.m. Whatever had gone down during their brief evening was enough to convince Siam that she wanted nothing to do with him, though. She would later state that he was weird and he gave her the creeps.
She went like this. Oh God, Mom, I never want to see that guy again. He's so weird. He's so creepy.
Having probably experienced male interactions not only within her line of work but outside of this sphere, she was probably listening to her gut feelings. However, he did not get the memo and continued to message Siam for more appointments. He also somehow got hold of her private number too, consistently badgering her, incessantly messaging her, especially during November and December of 2017. That in itself is hella suspicious and a major red flag, as it also went against all standard business protocol. Siam had stated to the man in question that she did not wish to have any contact with him. You know, she was perfectly within her rights to do so. He, however, had repeatedly sent her nasty, degrading messages in response. He had also allegedly visited Siam's place of residence, shouting and grabbing at the young girl before one of her colleagues had intervened and chased him off. So clearly you can see there was an escalation of behavior. There was unfortunately not much more to be done, as often when there are women within the adult industry who complain to police, they are not taken seriously. So on top of the fact that she also did not know who this man was, she ended up deciding to not go that route and just move on with her life. As she celebrated the new year with her mother and other friends, she welcomed new opportunities, new paths, and new dreams. Little did she know that just a few days into the new year, her life would come to a tragic end. And so we enter 2018. After returning home from their New Year's party getaway, Siam wasn't feeling too well. On the afternoon of the 4th of January, at 3 p.m., however, CCTV footage would show Siam and that male. You know, the one who was incessantly bothering her, leaving her property on Margaret Mayhem Street in a black Mercedes-Benz Vito with an unknown GP number plate. Her shoes would later be found outside of the property, signaling to all that she was not a willing participant in whatever had taken place. It would also be the first of many very strange coincidences, as Siam was abducted on the 4th of January. Because remember I asked you to keep a date in your mind from earlier? Well, it was January 4th of 2005 when her biological father, Howard, was murdered. Records differ in regards to the next chain of events, but what we do know for sure is that Siam was reported missing at the local police station. One would imagine, and perhaps it makes sense, that no one was able to actually identify the perpetrator, otherwise perhaps far swifter action would be taken. And then I would very well not be sitting here telling you her story. Unfortunately, as is with many cases within South Africa, not much more was done with her case, and it seemed to reach a standstill. This prompted Nan to reach out to friends and family, and ultimately this led to different private industries getting involved, namely Brad Nathanson's PI firm and Mobiclaw. Unlike in other cases I've witnessed online, most recently and most notably Jocelyn Smith's disappearance, Siam being missing only gained traction about a week after her disappearance. Missing posters then circulated via social media, with certain news publications publishing about the investigation into her disappearance. As I briefly alluded to earlier, almost all of these articles focused and highlighted Siam's occupation first and foremost, reducing her solely in many cases to the occupation that she had held at the time. And of course, the news of her workplace being within a neighborhood then spread, setting the tannies, the aunties, Tongues are wagging. And of course, the media also jumped on the role that Nan played in this entire chain of events. And whilst the private investigators, along with Siam's friends and family, continued to search, little did they realize that their efforts were in vain. On the 7th of January, the partially burnt body of a young female was discovered in a Midlands sugarcane field near New Hanover. The location was roughly 100 kilometers from the last place Siam was last seen alive. Although Siam's case had been reported to the police, the link between this discovery and her disappearance had not been made. In South Africa, information is often not easily transferred and made available throughout all police stations. Add to that the disturbing reality that so many people go missing every single day in the country. And perhaps the connection would have never been made as soon as it was if it wasn't for another bizarre twist of fate. Honestly, this case is just full of them. If you've ever heard about the 6 degrees of separation theory, it truly comes into play within this case. For those who are not aware, the theory of 6 degrees of separation suggests that any two people on Earth are just 6 connections or fewer apart. In other words, you can link yourself to any other person in the world through a chain of acquaintances that has no more than 6 intermediaries. So here's how it works. Imagine that you know a friend who knows a friend who knows a friend, and so on. If you follow this chain, it typically claims that it only takes 6 steps to connect you to anyone in the world, whether it's a farmer in a remote village or a famous celebrity. The idea first became popular in the 1920s and has been tested and explored many times since. This concept has also often been attributed to social psychologist Stanley Milgram, who conducted an experiment back in the 1960s to prove it. Yes, the very same Stanley Milgram who created that fascinating study that showcased people and their obedience to authority. You know, the Milgram experiment? The 2015 movie Experimenter is actually based on his life and his controversial work. The theory, however, highlights how surprisingly small our world is, thanks to social networks. It also emphasizes the interconnectedness of humanity, showing that despite our differences, we are all closer than we think. And with the way that technology has advanced, that is more true than ever today. Right, so theory aside, during a court case, a photographer from a local news agency overheard 2 men speaking. These 2 men happened to be police officers, and they were discussing the recently discovered corpse of a young girl who had been badly burnt and had still not been identified. Now, there wouldn't really be much from that conversation that would click for her until they mentioned the fact that the victim had a lip piercing. After having seen images of Siam floating around in the days before, and the fact that lip piercings are not the most common piercing, the photographer had ultimately done the math and it was mathing for her. She told her superior, and ultimately it was this interaction that would lead to the police contacting Siam's family for identification. Yet another odd coincidence within this case. And whilst I still have you on this path of strange coincidences, let's reference Siam's Instagram feed from 2016, less than 2 years before her murder. The image, quite artistic in nature, is taken of her lying in a field from a bird's eye view. The caption hauntingly reads, and I quote, "Don't mind me, just lying in a field, waiting to be abducted." End quote. And of course, it's evident that she is referencing UFO abduction, but in light of everything that would later take place, it is quite a strange coincidence. So although Nan had visited the mortuary, observed characteristics of what remained of the young girl, such as nail polish on one hand and some of her hair, and was ultimately certain that it was her daughter, it was only after DNA analysis that the final confirmation was to be made.
She was lying in this dying swan pose, and this hand was not burnt. It was the same color. Her flesh was normal, and her nail varnish was on this hand. But when I looked into her face, she had a whole hole in her face. There was no face. There were no teeth.
The case was therefore changed from an inquest to murder, and the search for the driver of the black Mercedes intensified. Eventually, on the 13th of January, 9 days after her disappearance, an identikit of the man who was said to have been driving the black Mercedes-Benz Vito seen in CCTV footage was shared with the public. Nan was the main source for this identikit, as she had recalled seeing this man many times on the property, believing that he was the one bothering her daughter and that he was the man who had ultimately taken her child. In the meantime, Siam's friends and family struggled to come to terms with her discovery. In interviews given to the press, friends had referred to her as one of the most caring and giving individuals who could really make the best of a bad situation. Her resilience was known by all of those who loved her, and they admired the heck out of her for all that she was. I mean, to this day, I've still had friends of hers contacting me, sharing their memories of her, and asking me to cover her story. So this one is for all of you too. It would only be towards the end of February when eventually Siam's body would be released to her family though. In March, she was laid to rest with her ashes scattered and a memorial service held. And as she was finally laid to rest, escape was narrowing for the man who was wanted. On the evening of Wednesday, the 18th of January, a 29-year-old man was detained whilst preparing to escape his Hillcrest property. Not by the police though, mind you. Oh no. He was arrested and detained by the PI and his team. Remember them?
I'll never forget taking that man down and handcuffing him and looking at his attire and smelling how good he smelled, expensive aftershave, and noting that he had a Mont Blanc pen in his pocket. And I thought to myself for a fleeting moment that I made a mistake, that I arrested the wrong guy.
The police were, of course, later called though. Dressed in a white shirt, smart grey pants, and Louis Vuitton shoes, this man was taken into custody. The black Mercedes-Benz Vito and an unlicensed 9mm firearm, along with 11 rounds of live ammunition, were also discovered and seized from his property by SAPS. This man was kept in custody pending his court appearance, where he was expected to face 16 charges, which included kidnapping, murder, and the possession of an unlicensed firearm and ammunition. In addition, there were also charges of fraud, reckless driving, failing to perform duties of a driver after an accident, and defeating the ends of justice related to a hit-and-run accident insurance claim. I'm sure you're pretty confused at this point, but never you fear because I'll get there soon enough. During these initial court appearances, it was stated that the media were not to take or share images of the man, due to not only the ongoing investigation and the pending charges, but also the fact that an identification parade still needed to be conducted. He, however, was finally eventually named as Sibonkosi Philani Gift Ntuli. So how exactly did the police reach this man, you may ask? Well, as I mentioned, they didn't really. Or at least not by themselves, that is. Let's rewind and let me explain. When Siam went missing, Nan had rallied the family together and hired a private investigator. Brad Nathanson of Brad Nathanson Investigations was instrumental in leading police to the alleged perpetrator's home. After he had heard on the news of Siam's body being found and the Mercedes-Benz Vito being involved, he started his investigation, which ultimately led him to dig deeper into a crash that had been reported that very same day. He then reached out to insurance companies and ultimately discovered an insurance claim filed for damages to a black vehicle of that make and model. This would ultimately lead him to the perpetrator's home. Yeah, we're talking some serious, real detective work. And get this, it wasn't even the first time that Brad had come into contact with that home. In 2016, he had worked on a previous case where a young girl who was working at a massage parlor at the time was taken at gunpoint. She was then held against her will in that house and raped. This woman would later be able to identify Ntuli as her perpetrator from an identity parade. So following Brad's lead, they had actually found that damaged vehicle that had been in an accident that very day. The day of Siam's abduction. Wait, what? On the day Siam was kidnapped, Ntuli had been involved in an accident where he had collided with a Ford Ranger on the corner of Margaret Mayton Drive and Hilton Drive. After the accident though, he had obviously failed to stop. He, however, had lied to his insurance company and stated that the accident had occurred 4 days after the fact. Right, so that catches you up, and that brings us back to Ntuli's arrest. Whilst in custody, he would later claim that he had been tortured in the police holding cells after his arrest. He then requested to be transferred to the Westville prison's holding cells. He stated that he had been sleeping on a mat for 2 weeks and tortured with a plastic bag. His request was granted. Throughout his initial court proceedings, he was unfazed, turning to look up at members of the public, even giving his family members a thumbs up at one point. During court proceedings, the PI who assisted in bringing Ntuli to justice, Brad Nathanson, along with members of his company, were banned from attending the proceedings as they were crucial witnesses. Over the weeks, yes weeks, of his bail application sessions, Ntuli would state how he had arrived home on the 17th of January to find his Mercedes Vito missing. It was then as he went to gather his phone from his vehicle that PI Brad had rocked up and detained him. He also claimed that the very same man, Brad, had pointed a gun at him and threatened him. He had claimed that, and I quote, "They told me I was going to leave, confessing to killing Siam Lee, or I was going to leave in a body bag. These were exact things they wanted me to say." End quote. He furthermore claimed that the team had searched his property without his permission. Ntuli maintained that he was not a person who ran away from justice, and was, as he mentioned in his own words, an honest businessman. He would also go on to laugh, bemused at some of the allegations that were laid against him, simply stating, "No comment." His behavior was so disturbing that he was even warned by the magistrate to quit laughing and smiling. And this was all still occurring during the bail application sessions. Seriously. The state then put forward the argument that he could be considered a flight risk as he had both the means as well as the connections. Keep that in mind for later. I know I'm asking you to save things for later, but just remember that, okay? Just remember it. After a grueling 2-month-long bail hearing towards the end of Jan in 2018, in a shocking turn of events, Ntuli's bail application was approved by Magistrate Mohammed Matala. He was granted bail for a mere 40,000 rand. Yeah. Kid you not. The approved bail hinged on the merits that the state had provided circumstantial evidence. It had also been argued that Ntuli's businesses and employees were suffering, whilst he was also responsible for taking care of his mother and his 14-year-old brother. The police and private investigators were also reprimanded for not following constitutional procedures during the arrest, in relation to the arrest as well as the search of his premises without a warrant. His bail conditions was that he lived in his parental home in Pietermaritzburg and provided 48 hours notice in case he needed to relocate. He also had to hand over his travel documents and report to the police station daily. When court sessions resumed, it was then heard that the trial would be headed to the Kwa-Zulu Natal High Court. 2 months later, the court would hear details, according to him that is, of how Siam was kidnapped and murdered. He would state that whilst he had kidnapped her, it was only because she owed him 50,000 rand and she hadn't paid him back. Look, I'm really uncertain how kidnapping and then taking someone's life is going to assist you in getting your funds back from them. But anyways, so according to him, this is what occurred on the day in question. On the 4th of January, after taking her against her will, he had ended up in an accident with another vehicle. He attempted to drive off, was followed, but managed to lose the other car and make it back home. There, Siam had been held captive in his home in Hillcrest multiple times. Around midnight on the 5th of January, when Siam told him that she was going to go to the police, he decided that it was time to end her life. He had then attempted to strangle her, but instead of taking her life, it had resulted in her ending up in an almost seizure-like state. This is a common side effect of strangulation, which occurs due to damage to the neck and brain. He then thought that he was going to put her out of her misery. Mind you, he caused this entire situation. And so he placed a cloth bag over her head. Following that, he had struck her multiple times until the life had left her body. He had then taken her body, loaded it into his vehicle, and headed out. On the way, he had purchased petrol from the local petrol station before heading out to the sugarcane fields. Upon reaching the field, he had thrown her body onto the ground, doused her in petrol, and set her alight. And so, 2 days after her kidnapping, in the evening of the 6th of January, she was left there. Data from his vehicle would later confirm this timeline. The post-mortem would reveal that her cause of death was a hemorrhage from head injury, as well as 90% burns with the charring of tissues. Hearing those details, Siam's mother wept uncontrollably.
I wasn't expecting to hear it today, so I feel really blindsided, but in a way that I needed to hear this at some point. It was the most painful thing to hear that I was burnt alive. What's wrong with a person to do that to another person, to a young girl?
It was also stated by some sources that smoke was found in her lungs, indicating the heart-wrenching possibility that she was still alive when she was set alight. Discarded like her life meant nothing. So 4 months later, Ntuli's trial was set to begin in High Court on March 11th of 2019. During this initial appearance, he was assaulted by a protester who had apparently thrown a rock at him. As the weeks progressed though, session after session, Ntuli gave the impression of someone whose health was rapidly declining, and he even appeared at one court session on crutches. A pre-trial date was set for July. However, just weeks before it was set to begin, things took a shocking turn. Remember how I mentioned earlier that this case was full of them? Yeah. This one, however, I'm not sure you're going to believe because quite honestly, I'm struggling to as well. On the 21st of June 2019, Sibolokosi Pilani Gift Ntuli passed away, according to his uncle, at 7:30 a.m. in the morning to be precise. The cause of death? Skin cancer. Kaposi sarcoma, to be precise, a rare cancer that causes lesions to form in the skin, lymph nodes, and other organs. Interestingly, it also often affects people with immune deficiencies, such as HIV or AIDS. Look, now I'm not suggesting that this wasn't the case. I just think it's a little odd that his condition was never referenced by his legal counsel at any point in time. Although it was stated that he was HIV positive, I feel like something as significant and serious as cancer would have been mentioned, particularly for mitigation within his bail hearing or trial especially. But anyways, some breathed a sigh of relief, like Lucky. Oh wait, I haven't told you about her, but I'm getting there, I promise. Whilst others remained upset that he would no longer be able to be held accountable for his cruel actions. Nan would move to Bloemfontein shortly after, with the plan to not only write a book about the entire experience, but also to attend a rehabilitation facility.
You can't get worse than Monk. Well, he's dead, okay. But definitely, if the DP was still applied in South Africa, I'd love to have got that, you know what I mean? I wish he had died violently, you know, feelings of bitterness, of like his family not being shamed. You know, I mean, his family have not been gracious at all throughout this.
And so, at the beginning of July, instead of the trial beginning, the case was officially struck off the roll. Although there had been concerns with the copy of Ntuli's death certificate, they were apparently explained away as an issue with the printers at the Home Affairs Office. You see, more things that just raise red flags for me. Allegedly, though, the prints taken off the body at the funeral parlor matched those of Ntuli at the time of his arrest. As many were in the same level of disbelief that I'm sure you are in now, especially in hindsight given Thabo Bester's case. If you haven't heard about that case, I've covered it, you should watch it. You should learn about it. It's crazy. The NPA, the National Prosecuting Authority, called upon the police to verify the death. This also came after a source close to the investigation was not convinced that the body was that of Ntuli. But like I said, it was ultimately confirmed that his fingerprints were a match, and so the court case was struck off the roll. Mind you, Thabo Bester's body was recovered after a fire broke out in his prison cell, and then months later he was spotted shopping in a local grocery store. So yeah, some things are exactly what they seem to be, and others, well, they're just really not. You can't blame a girl, especially a girl with true crime knowledge, for being skeptical. To this day, since there was no closure or trial in this case, the motive still remains unclear. Some believe that it was other sex workers living with Siam who owed 50,000 rand to Ntuli. According to this theory, she had been kidnapped for ransom. Other theories suggest that Siam rejected Ntuli, leading him to becoming bitter. Based on the multiple cases I've encountered working in this field, as well as his particular behavior in the past, I'm more inclined to believe the latter. From my experience, the best indication of a perpetrator's future behaviors are their past actions. So let's dive deeper into Ntuli's background, and perhaps you'll then understand why I hold this perspective. 29-year-old Sibolokosi Pilani Gift Ntuli had made quite a success of his life. To those who knew and loved him, he had lived up to his name, Sibolokosi, which roughly translates to God's plan. He was a biochemist who owned a diesel processing plant called Better Fuels, along with being the director of 9 other companies. He had published articles in the field and would later be described in the media as someone who was, quote, highly intelligent and spoke beautiful English. End quote. The truth of the matter, though, was that he was successful, he was well known, and he was admired and respected in the business industry. But his success on the outside masked the disturbing man that he was on the inside. I mean, he had allegedly said when he was arrested that the murder would never be pinned on him because he had powerful connections. He had said, and I quote, "I am a biochemist. I know how to clean a crime scene." End quote. Upon searching his home, it was alleged that he was also fixated on libido-boosting pills, enlargement creams, and other sexual devices were found in the house. The thing is, though, as respected as he was in the industry, Ntuli had a history of criminal and deviant behavior. The way he related to women in particular was volatile, and his actions disturbing, to say the least. At one stage in his life, not too long before the murder, he had even placed an advert online and in the newspaper advertising his ex-fiancée as a prostitute. No, I'm not even kidding. And yes, he was a full-on adult businessman acting in that manner. But aside from juvenile attempts at humiliation, which mind you can actually have incredibly dangerous consequences for the victim, his behavior towards this woman in particular was far more destructive. It's at this point that I would like to introduce you to Lucky Mthembu. Remember her? I briefly mentioned her name earlier. Well, some of you may recognize her name, as she was a former Miss South Africa Teen 2009 runner-up. A beautiful person inside and out, she had met Ntuli and their relationship had begun in 2014. After about 2 years together, they were engaged to be married and she then moved into his home. As with many relationships that become toxic, it was at this point that he had become emotionally, financially, and physically abusive. An entire trifecta of red flags. In one particular incident on the 6th of June 2015, Lucky had sustained a broken ankle amongst other injuries due to the force of his attack. After this, she was brave enough to take the plunge, put herself first, and she managed to walk away. She thus ended their relationship and their engagement. As many familiar with the patterns of domestic violence will know, whilst it is incredibly dangerous to stay within such relationships, exiting is just as difficult and puts the individual leaving the abuser at an even higher risk sometimes. That may help to answer the age-old question that many who are not familiar with these scenarios love to ask, namely,
"But why did she stay? But why didn't she leave sooner?"
Lucky had also ended up laying charges of attempted murder and intimidation against him, along with filing for a protection order. And here's where Ntuli had shown his true colors and the levels that he was willing to go to. After the protection order had been filed, he had sneakily called Debonair's, ordering a pizza on her behalf in an attempt to obtain her address. He did, however, not technically contravene the protection order, as he did not contact her after learning that information. For him, it was more about control and psychological warfare. After that incident, when she had received the confirmation from the pizza outlet and then upon hearing the recording had heard Ntuli's voice, she moved, fearing for her safety. You know, as one would. Every time she approached the police to report a violation of the protection order or the threats in place, no one bothered to follow up or do anything. Unfortunately, if you know the state of affairs in many, not all, but many of the police stations within the country, this will come as no surprise. But I don't think it's just a South African thing though, as I've heard of many cases on a global scale where protection orders and stalking is not really taken seriously. Lucky would also mention how her mother's car had been set alight and her mother was later murdered, exiting her place of work. But unfortunately, she had no proof that it was Ntuli, just a sneaking suspicion. That suspicion, along with text messages that he had sent her, apparently mocking her mother's death, amused that her killers had not yet been arrested. Even if he was not involved with that, what the actual is that about? Her mother's case was also never solved. After her mother's murder, Lucky had deregistered from university and was admitted to a psychiatric hospital. I mean, that girl had been through so much at that point. In February of 2017, Yes, over a year later, Ntuli had placed those adverts I mentioned. Yeah, you know, the ones where he listed Lucky as a sex worker. In his later defense, he had stated that it was simply to intimidate her, to return a pot and a spear that he had given her as a lobola gift. For those unaware, lobola is a customary part of many African marriages and is a payment made by the groom's family to the bride's family. And also, it was a gift. What was he expecting? 7 months before Siam's murder, Lucky had submitted an appeal to the Minister of Police at the time, Fikile Mbulula. It was an 11-page document showcasing the fact that Ntuli was a danger to society. She had said, and I quote, "He reflects the behavior of a narcissist and a psychopath, as he continues to believe he is above everything and everyone, including the law." Unfortunately, though, even though her brave efforts made the news, it appears that ultimately her words fell upon deaf ears. And just months later, the world would finally understand what she meant. And you know what? I'm sure it's evident, but Lucky and Siam were not Ntuli's only victims. After his breakup with Lucky, Ntuli had also, on March 21st of 2016, kidnapped a worker, held her at gunpoint, forced her to remove her clothing, and then raped her. This was the same woman that I mentioned earlier, who was later able to identify him from a police identity parade. During her ordeal, the man who had referred to himself as Oscar had called her a white racist. He had then proceeded to steal her cell phones. This woman was listed on the very same website as Siam. He eventually let her go after she convinced him that she was not going to report the to anyone. Although she had not wanted to press charges, her parents had approached a PI, Brad Nathanson. Yes, the very same one. And in true 6 Degrees of Separation style, their narratives would later intersect and collide, like a perfect storm. Although she was not aware of further identifying details of this individual, she remembered a road name. After driving the road several times with this PI, she was able to point out the house. The house on Controversy Drive. Yes, that was the actual road name. It would later turn out that it wasn't that particular house, but the one next door. But if you ask me, she did a damn good job at the time. With no charges laid, though, the case would never see a courtroom or see Ntuli held accountable for his actions on that fateful day. And once again, he would get away with his ever-escalating behavior. As Ntuli never made it to trial or a psychological assessment, we can never know what professional diagnosis, if any, would have been given. All we can really understand, though, is his pattern of seemingly narcissistic and toxic behavior that ultimately ended in Siam losing her life. One of the many things, though, that still bother me about this case, besides the glaringly obvious one, is how the media treated Siam. It's the way in which the media, and often the public, treat victims who just so happen to be in the adult industry. In poor attempts at journalism, articles were published that focused on Siam and her mother's lifestyle, as opposed to the heinous act that was committed. Her entire life, her heart, her beautiful spirit, was reduced to one thing: her occupation at that time. Essentially, the idea that is continuously shared when this happens is the antiquated one, that the victim is to be blamed. As individuals who are responsible for sharing narratives, we need to do better. And as Siam quoted Eva Green on an Instagram post, "Nipples aren't killing children. They should be more concerned about the wars that are happening. There's so much violence in this world. There's so many legitimate things to be upset about besides nipples." End quote. And honestly, I must agree. The truth is, Siam was just a girl with big dreams and the ability to turn those dreams into a reality. She was just never allowed the opportunity. Her spirit was fierce, her heart full of love for those around her. Just one look at her social media pages could show you exactly who she was. Not just a girl involved in the adult industry through no true desire of her own. No. She was a girl who honored all creatures, from the tiniest of frogs that could fit in the palm of your hand, to far larger cows who also received strokes of love from her. She practiced what she preached: kindness, authenticity, and pure positivity. She was radiant. She was light. And I'm almost certain that now that she has left this plane, she has reconnected with the earth that she so deeply loved. She is the sunshine on a summer's day. She is in the cool breeze of an autumn evening. She is the drops of rain that splash onto your face in the midst of winter. And she is the first sunflower blooming as spring begins. She is everything and everywhere. And now that you too know her story, she will never be just another number. She will never be forgotten. And just like the earth she ultimately returned to, she will live on. Rest easy, Siam Lee. To end with a quote that she dearly loved. You do not need to be small. You do not need to be delicate. Be loud. Be passionate. Because you'll regret minimizing yourself to please others. End quote. Until the next one, stay safe, stay blessed, and stay the amazing human beings that I know each and every single one of you are. Bye.